Hello and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm glad you've joined me, ready to slow down, breathe deeply, and let your thoughts drift back through the quiet corridors of time. This is your moment to leave the noise of the day behind, to step away from screens and deadlines and the relentless rush of now, and step gently into the high valleys of ancient Mexico, where pyramids rise beneath endless skies, and a city once stood that was so magnificent, so impossibly vast, that those who found it centuries later could only believe the gods themselves had built it. Here, in this space between past and present, we wander together through streets that stretch in perfect geometry beneath volcanic peaks. We climb the steps of pyramids that dwarf those of Egypt, stone upon stone rising toward the sun. We stand in plazas where more than 100,000 people once gathered, where voices echoed in languages no one remembers, where merchants traded obsidian and jade and precious feathers from distant jungles. We imagine the priests climbing temple stairs at dawn, the families living in apartment complexes built to last generations, the artists painting murals that would fade to whispers after the people mysteriously walked away. Each episode here isn't just about dates and battles. It's not about memorizing dynasties or cataloguing ruins left behind. It's about the lives lived, the builder shaping stone with patient hands, the mother teaching her child which stars guided the seasons, the elder standing at the city's edge wondering what lay beyond the mountains. It's about the mysteries carved into stone and left for us to wonder about, the questions that echo through empty temples, the silences that speak louder than any written word. If you enjoy these quiet journeys through time, a like and a subscribe help keep this channel alive, help us continue exploring together. But for now, you don't need to do anything but listen. There is a place in Mexico where the earth rises into monuments so vast they dwarf the pyramids of Egypt, where streets laid in perfect geometry stretch for miles beneath volcanic peaks, where every stone whispers a question no one can answer. This place has no name, not really. The people who built it left no writing, no declaration of who they were or what they called themselves. They simply vanished. When the Aztecs arrived in the Valley of Mexico in the 14th century, they found ruins so monumental, so impossibly ancient. They believed only gods could have constructed them. They called it Teotihuacan, the place where the gods were born. They believed that here, in this silent city of giants, the universe itself had been created, that the sun and moon had been set aflame in sacrifice. That time began among these weathered stones. But the Aztecs were wrong about one thing. This was not the work of gods. It was the work of humans, ordinary people who built one of the largest cities the ancient world had ever seen, and then walked away from it, leaving behind only silence and stone. By the time the Aztecs wandered through its empty avenues, Teotihuacan had been abandoned for more than 600 years. The roofs had collapsed. The murals had faded. The Great Pyramids stood like mountains covered in grass and shrubs, their true shape hidden beneath centuries of wind and rain. And yet, even in ruin, the city commanded reverence. Today, Teotihuacan remains one of the greatest mysteries in archaeology. We know it was inhabited. We know it thrived. We know that at its height more than 100,000 people walked its streets, more than lived in Rome during the same period. But we do not know what language they spoke. We do not know what they called their kings, if they had kings at all. We do not know why they left. What we do know is this. Around 2,000 years ago, in a valley ringed by mountains and fed by springs, a group of people began to build. They did not build haphazardly. They built with intention, with precision, with a vision of something far greater than a simple settlement. They aligned their city to the stars. They oriented their greatest pyramid to face the setting sun on specific days of the year. They carved channels for water, laid out neighborhoods in grids, and constructed apartment complexes that housed families for generations. And then, at the peak of their power, they set fire to their temples, ritually destroyed their own icons, and abandoned the city to the wind. Imagine walking through Teotihuacan in the 9th century after the people had gone. Imagine standing at the base of the Pyramid of the Sun, a structure containing more than 1 million cubic meters of stone and earth, and knowing that no one alive remembers who built it. Imagine the weight of all that forgotten knowledge pressing down on the ruins. For more than 1,000 years, Teotihuacan was a ghost, Birds nested in the empty temples, farmers planted crops in the old plazas, and still travellers came. Still they stood in awe. The Spanish conquistadors saw it in the 16th century and marvelled, though they barely understood what they were looking at. Colonial scholars speculated it had been built by the Toltecs, or perhaps wandering tribes. None of them guessed the truth, because the truth was far stranger. Teotihuacan was not the capital of an empire in the traditional sense. It did not conquer, at least not in the way we usually understand power. Instead, it became a centre, a gathering place, a city that drew people from across Mesoamerica not through force, but through influence, through trade, through something we might call belief. This is the story of that city. This is the story of the people who built it, the lives they lived, and the mystery they left behind. It is a story without an ending, because we are still searching for answers. But it is a story worth telling, because in the ruins of Teotihuacan, we see something essential about what it means to be human, to dream of permanence, to reach for the divine, and to leave behind only questions carved in stone. Welcome to the city where gods were born. The Valley of Mexico, 2,000 years ago, was a place of water and light. Lakes shimmered in the basin, fed by snowmelt from the volcanic peaks that ringed the valley like sleeping giants. The air smelled of pine and wet earth. The sky stretched wide and blue, interrupted only by the occasional plume of smoke from distant Popocatépetl, the mountain the Aztecs would later call the Smoking Mountain, though they had not yet arrived to name it. This was a fertile land, a place where maize grew tall and beans climbed in spirals toward the sun. Small villages dotted the lakeshore, clusters of thatched huts where families fished and farmed and worshipped gods whose names are lost to us now. The people here were not primitive. They cultivated crops, fired pottery, carved jade, and traded obsidian, that volcanic glass sharper than steel, across distances that would take weeks to travel on foot. But they were not yet builders of pyramids. They were not yet the people who would transform this valley into the heart of an empire. Somewhere around 100 BC, something began to shift. We do not know what triggered it, a charismatic leader, a religious vision, a slow accumulation of wealth and influence, but the scattered communities near a pair of caves in the northeastern part of the valley began to coalesce. They began to build not just homes but monuments, not just villages but a city. The location they chose was no accident. Beneath the place that would become the Pyramid of the Sun, there was a cave, a natural tunnel carved by ancient lava flows. To the people of Mesoamerica, caves were sacred, portals to the underworld, places where the earth opened to reveal its secrets. This cave in particular seems to have held profound significance. It was shaped like a four-lobed flower, the symbol of creation in later Mesoamerican cosmology. It pointed toward the setting sun. Perhaps the first builders believed that the gods emerged from this cave. Perhaps they believed it was the navel of the world, the place where sky and earth and underworld met. We can only speculate. But what is certain is that they chose to build their most sacred pyramid directly above it, sealing the cave beneath millions of stones, as if to anchor the divine to the earth itself. The early city was modest. A few rectangular platforms, a scattering of homes built from adobe and wood, a marketplace where traders exchanged salt and cacao and colourful feathers from distant jungles. But the vision was already there. You can see it in the alignment of the streets, laid out in a grid that ignored the natural terrain, that imposed human order on the landscape with a confidence bordering on arrogance. The people who lived in this early Teotihuacan were farmers and craftsmen. They woke before dawn and worked the fields, coaxing life from volcanic soil. They shaped clay into bowls and figurines. They knapped obsidian into blades so fine you could see the light through them. And in the evenings they gathered in courtyards to eat and talk and watch the stars wheel overhead in their eternal patterns. Their gods were not yet the gods of the Aztecs. The feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl, may have existed in some early form, but his mythology had not yet crystallized into the stories we know today. The rain god, Tlaloc, was perhaps revered here. His image eventually painted on temple walls, his goggle eyes staring out from murals that would survive for centuries. But the religious life of these early Teotihuacanos remains shadowy, glimpsed only through fragments of pottery and the occasional offering buried beneath a floor. What is clear is that they were organized. The construction of even the earliest platforms required coordination, planning, the ability to mobilize labor and resources. Someone had to decide where the stones would go. Someone had to ensure that workers were fed. Someone had to hold the vision in their mind and translate it into architecture. By the time of Christ, Teotihuacan was no longer a village. It was a town, and it was growing. People were arriving from the surrounding valleys, drawn by opportunity or coercion, we cannot say. They brought their traditions with them, their styles of pottery, their ways of burying the dead. And slowly, these traditions began to blend, to merge into something new. The population swelled. Neighborhoods expanded, and the builders turned their attention to something far more ambitious than platforms and plazas. They began to raise the Pyramid of the Sun. It would take decades, generations. The pyramid we see today, weathered and partially restored, was not built in a single campaign. It grew in stages, layer upon layer, each ruler or council adding to the height, expanding the base, until it stood more than 70 meters tall, a mountain made by human hands. Imagine the labor. Imagine thousands of workers hauling baskets of earth and stone up ramps that grew steeper with every layer. Imagine the sound of it, the scrape of feet on packed dirt, the rhythmic chants to keep the work synchronized, the crack of stone on stone. Imagine the dust hanging in the air, turning the sunlight hazy and golden. And imagine the moment when the final stone was placed, when the pyramid was complete, when the workers stood back and saw what they had made. A stairway to the heavens, a throne for the sun itself. The valley was changing, the city was rising, and the people who built it were becoming something more than villagers. They were becoming Teotihuacanos, citizens of a city that would soon dominate Mesoamerica, though they could not have known it yet. All they knew was that the gods had chosen this place, and they would build accordingly. For centuries, Teotihuacan slept beneath the Mexican sun, half buried, half remembered, a place of legends and whispers. Farmers planted crops between the mounds. Treasure hunters dug shallow pits, hoping to find gold that was never there. The pyramids, worn smooth by wind and rain, looked more like hills than monuments, their sharp edges softened by time and vegetation. Then, in the late 19th century, the world began to take notice. The year was 1864. Mexico was in turmoil, occupied by French forces, its sovereignty hanging by a thread. But even in the chaos of war, there were those who looked to the past. A Mexican scholar named Antonio Garcia Cubas published the first systematic map of Teotihuacan, documenting the major structures and proposing that this was no random collection of ruins, but a planned city of immense scale. His work was largely ignored. Mexico had more pressing concerns, but the seed was planted. Decades passed. Mexico regained its independence. The 19th century gave way to the 20th. And slowly archaeologists began to arrive, drawn by rumours of the great city in the valley, the place the Aztecs had called sacred. The first serious excavations began in 1905, led by Leopoldo Batres, a controversial figure in Mexican archaeology. Batres was ambitious, sometimes reckless, more interested in spectacle than science. He wanted to restore the Pyramid of the Sun in time for Mexico's centennial celebration of independence in 1910. He wanted to give his nation a monument to rival the pyramids of Egypt. What he did instead was strip away much of the pyramid's outer layer, removing the original facing stones in a misguided attempt to find an earlier structure beneath. He damaged murals. He discarded artifacts that did not fit his theories. He reconstructed the pyramid not as it had been, but as he imagined it should be, adding a fifth terrace that likely never existed. And yet, despite his flaws, despite the harm he caused, Batres revealed something extraordinary. He proved that Teotihuacan was not just large, it was massive. He uncovered sections of the Avenue of the Dead, that great north-south boulevard that bisects the city. He excavated temples and residential compounds. He found evidence of a civilization far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. News of his discoveries spread. Photographs of the pyramids appeared in newspapers across Europe and America. Scholars debated the implications. Who had built this city? When had it flourished? And why had it been abandoned? In the decades that followed, a new generation of archaeologists arrived, trained in more rigorous methods, more respectful of the ruins. They brought modern tools, stratigraphic techniques, the ability to date materials with increasing precision. Slowly, painstakingly, they began to reconstruct the story of Teotihuacan. They discovered that the city was far older than anyone had thought, its origins stretching back 2,000 years. They found that it had been inhabited continuously for more than 6 centuries, growing from a small settlement to a metropolis of staggering size. They mapped the city's grid, noting how every building, every street, every pyramid aligned to a central axis tilted 15.5 degrees east of true north, oriented to the point where the sun set on certain sacred days. They excavated the Pyramid of the Moon, smaller than the Pyramid of the Sun but no less impressive, its plaza surrounded by platforms that once held temples and elite residences. Beneath the pyramid they found burials, sacrificial offerings, caches of obsidian blades and jade ornaments, evidence of rituals performed in the shadow of the gods. They dug through layers of volcanic ash and discovered that Teotihuacan had been damaged by an eruption in the 1st century AD, but had rebuilt, had persevered, had grown even larger in the aftermath. And they found the murals. Hidden beneath later construction, sealed in the walls of apartment compounds, were paintings of astonishing beauty. Gods and priests processed across plaster in brilliant reds and greens and yellows. Jaguars prowled through fields of flowers. Feathered serpents coiled around temples. Rain gods presided over ceremonies, their hands scattering seeds or water or jade beads, symbols of fertility and wealth. These murals were revelations. They showed that Teotihuacan was not a drab city of stone, but a riot of colour, a place where every surface was adorned, where beauty and ritual were woven into daily life. They showed processions and offerings and games, hints of the ceremonies that had filled the plazas and pyramids. But they also showed something else. They showed no kings. In other Mesoamerican cities, murals and monuments glorified rulers, depicted them in elaborate headdresses, recorded their conquests and their lineages. But in Teotihuacan there were no such images. The murals showed priests and gods and anonymous figures in ritual dress, but never individuals elevated above others, never names carved in stone. This was strange, this was unprecedented, and it suggested that Teotihuacan had been governed in a way unlike any other city of its time, perhaps by a council, perhaps by priests, perhaps by some form of collective leadership that did not celebrate individual power. The more archaeologists dug, the more questions they found. Every answer revealed new mysteries. Every trench opened new puzzles. By the mid-20th century, the ruins had been partially restored. The pyramids rose once again against the sky, their terraces rebuilt, their stairways leading visitors up toward the clouds. Tourists began to arrive, drawn by the romance of the lost city, by the chance to walk where ancients had walked. But for the archaeologists, the work was just beginning. Beneath the plazas, beneath the pyramids, beneath the floors of countless apartments, there were still secrets waiting. There were tunnels to explore, burials to excavate, offerings to catalogue, and there was still the greatest question of all. Who were these people? Where had they come from? And why, at the height of their power, had they simply walked away? The discovery of Teotihuacan was not a single moment. It was a process, a slow unveiling that continues to this day. Every season brings new findings. Every excavation peels back another layer of time. The city is giving up its secrets. But it is doing so reluctantly, one stone at a time. When the first photographs of Teotihuacan reached academic circles in Europe and North America, the reaction was immediate and divided. Some scholars marvelled, others scoffed. It was the early 20th century, a time when archaeology was still young, when theories about ancient civilizations were tangled with prejudice and assumption. Many Western scholars believed that the great monuments of the world, the pyramids of Egypt, the temples of Greece, the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, had all sprung from a single source, a lost civilization that had spread its knowledge across the globe. The idea that indigenous people in Mexico could have built a city rivaling Rome seemed to some implausible. And yet, the evidence was undeniable. The photographs showed pyramids of staggering size. The maps revealed a city laid out with geometric precision. The artifacts, The pottery shards and obsidian blades and jade carvings spoke of a sophisticated culture with trade networks stretching across Mesoamerica. The debate began in earnest. Some scholars argued that Teotihuacan must have been built by the Toltecs, a semi-legendary civilization that the Aztecs claimed as their ancestors. This theory was convenient. It aligned with Aztec mythology, and it provided a clear lineage from the ancient city to the later empires. But it was also wrong. Dating techniques, crude as they were, suggested that Teotihuacan was far older than the Toltec period, that it had been abandoned centuries before the Toltecs rose to power. Others proposed that the city had been built by migrants from the south, perhaps Maya refugees fleeing drought or war. This theory gained traction when archaeologists noticed similarities between Teotihuacan's architecture and certain Maya sites. But as more evidence emerged, it became clear that the influence had flowed the other way. Teotihuacan had influenced the Maya, not the reverse. A few bold voices suggested something even more radical. They proposed that Teotihuacan represented an indigenous Mexican civilization, one that had arisen independently, without outside influence, that had developed its own architectural styles, its own religious beliefs, its own urban planning. This idea was met with skepticism, even ridicule. How could a people without writing, without the wheel, without metal tools have built such a city? And yet that is exactly what they had done. The skepticism was not limited to foreigners. Even within Mexico, there were those who struggled to reconcile the grandeur of Teotihuacan with their understanding of pre-Columbian history. The Spanish conquest had left deep scars, a legacy of colonialism that had erased or distorted much of the indigenous past. Many Mexicans had been taught to see their pre-Hispanic ancestors as primitive, as needing European civilization to lift them from barbarism. Teotihuacan challenged that narrative. It demanded a reckoning. As more excavations took place, as more artifacts were uncovered, the wonder began to outweigh the skepticism. Scholars from around the world travelled to Mexico to see the ruins for themselves. They walked the Avenue of the Dead, stood atop the pyramids, and felt the weight of history pressing down on them. They began to ask better questions, not whether Teotihuacan was real, but how it had functioned. Not whether it was important, but why it had been built in this specific location. Not whether the people were capable, but what had driven them to such ambition. The murals were particularly compelling. When archaeologists uncovered the first intact paintings in the 1940s and 50s, they revealed a level of artistry that stunned even the skeptics. These were not crude drawings. These were sophisticated compositions layered with symbolism, executed with skill and precision. One mural, found in the Tepantitla compound, depicted a paradise, a place of abundance where people played and danced beneath a flowering tree. Water flowed in rivers filled with fish. Butterflies drifted through the air. It was a vision of the afterlife, or perhaps a memory of a golden age, rendered in colours that had survived 14 centuries buried in darkness. Another mural showed the storm god, Tlaloc, his eyes ringed with circles like goggles, his hands scattering seeds or rain or blessings upon the earth. He appeared again and again throughout the city, a constant presence, a reminder that water was life, that the gods controlled the rains, and that the people owed them reverence. These discoveries forced a reassessment. Teotihuacan was not just a city. It was a work of art, a canvas on which an entire civilization had painted its beliefs, its hopes, its understanding of the cosmos. But with wonder came more questions. If the people of Teotihuacan were so advanced, why had they left no writing? The Maya had carved their history into stone, recording kings and conquests and astronomical observations in intricate glyphs. The Zapotecs of Oaxaca had developed a script. Even earlier Olmec sites showed proto-writing. But Teotihuacan, for all its sophistication, had left no texts, no inscriptions, no way to read its story in its own words. This absence haunted researchers. It meant that everything they knew about Teotihuacan was interpretation, inference drawn from pottery and murals and the layout of buildings. It meant they would never know what the people called themselves, what names they gave to their gods, what stories they told their children. The skeptics seized on this. Without writing, they argued, how could we truly call Teotihuacan a civilization? How could we compare it to Egypt or Rome or China, cultures that had left libraries of knowledge? But the defenders of Teotihuacan pointed to the city itself. They argued that architecture was a form of writing, that the pyramids were texts carved in stone, that the alignment of buildings to celestial events was a kind of record, a way of encoding knowledge for future generations. They argued that the absence of writing did not mean the absence of complexity, only a different way of preserving memory. The debate continues to this day, but one thing is certain. Teotihuacan was no accident. It was no fluke. It was the product of human ingenuity, human labour, human vision. And whether or not scholars wanted to accept it, the city demanded respect. The first response to Teotihuacan was wonder and skepticism in equal measure. But over time, as the evidence mounted, as the excavations deepened, wonder won. The Aztecs, who found Teotihuacan in ruins, told stories about it that echoed through the centuries. They believed that this was the place where the gods had gathered after the world had been destroyed for the fourth time, where they had convened in darkness to decide how to bring back the sun. According to their mythology, 2 gods volunteered for the task. One was proud and wealthy, adorned with jade and feathers. The other was humble, covered in sores, a god of illness and penance. A great fire was built in the plaza before the pyramids. The proud god approached the flames, but hesitated, afraid of the pain. The humble god did not hesitate. He threw himself into the fire and was transformed into the sun. Shamed, the proud god followed, becoming the moon. And thus the 5th sun was born, the age in which the Aztecs lived, an age destined to end in earthquakes and destruction. This story was sacred to the Aztecs. It explained the origin of the cosmos. It justified their practice of human sacrifice, for the sun needed blood to continue its journey across the sky. And it made Teotihuacan the holiest place in their world, the navel of creation, the site where time itself had been reborn. When the Aztecs walked through the ruins, they believed they were walking through the footsteps of gods. But archaeology tells a different story. The people who built Teotihuacan were not gods. They were farmers and craftsmen, priests and labourers, ordinary people who accomplished extraordinary things. They did not create the sun. They created a city, arguably the greatest city of its time in the Americas, and perhaps the 6th largest city in the entire world during its peak. The contradiction between legend and reality is profound. It reveals how history becomes mythology, how the passage of time transforms human achievement into divine mystery. The Aztecs were not entirely wrong, though. Teotihuacan was a place of creation, not of the cosmos, but of a new kind of society. It was a place where diverse peoples came together and forged a shared identity. It was a place where urban planning reached heights that would not be seen again in Mesoamerica until the rise of the Aztec capital itself, Tenochtitlan, more than 600 years later. But the Aztecs could not have known this. They had no way to date the ruins. They had no way to know that Teotihuacan had been abandoned in the 8th century, 500 years before their own empire began. They saw the pyramids and assumed they were timeless, eternal works of the divine. In a way, this misunderstanding is beautiful. It shows how deeply Teotihuacan impressed itself on the imagination of later peoples, how its scale and ambition transcended ordinary human experience and became something mythic. Modern archaeologists face a different challenge. They must separate legend from fact, must resist the temptation to see Teotihuacan through the lens of Aztec mythology. The murals, the pyramids, the offerings, all must be interpreted on their own terms, without assuming that later beliefs applied to earlier builders. This is harder than it sounds. The Aztecs dominated central Mexico for centuries. Their language, Nahuatl, became the common tongue. Their gods, Quetzalcoatl and Tlaloc and Huitzilopochtli, became the standard pantheon. When Spanish friars arrived and began recording indigenous beliefs, they relied on Aztec informants, and so much of what we think we know about Mesoamerican religion is filtered through an Aztec perspective. But Teotihuacan predates the Aztecs. Its people spoke a different language, perhaps an early form of Totonac or Otomi, we cannot be sure. Their gods may have been similar to later deities, but their mythology was likely different, their rituals distinct. The challenge for archaeologists is to see Teotihuacan as it was, not as the Aztecs imagined it to be. And yet, the legends are not useless. They tell us how Teotihuacan was remembered, how it shaped the cultures that came after. They tell us that even in ruin, even abandoned, the city retained a power that transcended its physical presence. The Aztecs made pilgrimages to Teotihuacan. They left offerings at the pyramids. They buried their dead in the ancient plazas, hoping that proximity to the sacred city would ease their passage to the afterlife. They renovated some of the structures, adding their own murals and sculptures, layering their beliefs onto the older city like pages in a palimpsest. In this way, Teotihuacan became a bridge between past and present, a place where history and mythology intertwined so deeply that separating them became almost impossible. The contradiction remains. The city where gods were born was actually a city where humans built. The place of cosmic creation was a place of very earthly labour and ambition. The eternal monuments were constructed stone by stone, generation by generation, by people who laughed and argued and dreamed and died. But perhaps the contradiction is the point. Perhaps the genius of Teotihuacan lies precisely in this, in its ability to inspire such reverence that it became more than a city, became a myth, a story so powerful that it survived the collapse of the civilization that built it. The Aztecs were not wrong to call it the birthplace of the gods. In a sense it was, because the people who built Teotihuacan reached so high, built so grand, that they achieved something close to immortality. Not for themselves, their names are lost, but for their city, which even now, 2,000 years later, stands as a testament to what humans can accomplish when they dare to dream beyond the limits of their own lives. Legends and reality. Gods and humans. The sacred and the mundane. In Teotihuacan, these contradictions are not resolved. They are held in tension, balanced like the sun and moon in the Aztec story, each illuminating the other, each incomplete without the other. The city was built by mortals, but what they built was divine. For more than a century, scholars have debated the fundamental questions about Teotihuacan. Who built it? Who governed it? Why did it fall? And the debates are far from settled. The first major theory emerged in the early 20th century. It proposed that Teotihuacan was an empire, a militaristic state that conquered its neighbours and extracted tribute to fund its monumental construction. This theory was based partly on evidence from Maya sites, where Teotihuacan-style artefacts and iconography appeared suddenly in the 4th century AD, suggesting some kind of intervention or invasion. Proponents pointed to the discovery of weapons, obsidian blades and spear throwers in Teotihuacan burials. They noted the presence of fortifications at some sites in the Teotihuacan sphere of influence. They argued that only military power could have sustained such a large city, that tribute and conquest were necessary to feed 100,000 mouths. But other scholars disagreed. They pointed out that there was little direct evidence of warfare in Teotihuacan's art. The murals showed processions and rituals, not battles. There were no images of bound captives, no monuments celebrating military victories, nothing like the martial propaganda found in later Aztec or Maya cities. Instead, they proposed an alternative. Teotihuacan was not an empire. It was a trade hub, a cosmopolitan centre that grew wealthy through commerce rather than conquest. Obsidian from nearby mines was worked in Teotihuacan workshops and distributed across Mesoamerica. Cacao and feathers and jade flowed into the city from distant regions. The wealth generated by this trade funded the pyramids and sustained the population. This theory gained support as archaeologists excavated residential compounds and found evidence of craft specialization. Entire neighborhoods were dedicated to making pottery or working obsidian or producing textiles. The city functioned like a massive workshop producing goods for export and attracting traders from hundreds of miles away. A third theory emerged in the late 20th century, challenging both of the previous models. It suggested that Teotihuacan was neither an empire nor merely a trade city. It was a pilgrimage centre, a sacred city that drew people not through force or commerce alone, but through religious devotion. This theory was based on the sheer scale of the pyramids and temples, far more space dedicated to ritual than would be necessary for a purely political or economic capital. It noted the presence of residential compounds from different regions, each maintaining distinct pottery styles and burial practices, suggesting that people from across Mesoamerica had migrated to Teotihuacan to be near the sacred centre. Perhaps, proponents argued, Teotihuacan was like Mecca or Jerusalem, a city whose power came not from armies or markets, but from its status as a holy site, a place where the divine was believed to be present. The debates intensified as new evidence emerged. In the 1980s and 90s, archaeologists discovered that Teotihuacan had experienced a dramatic transformation around the 4th century AD. The city underwent massive urban renewal. Old neighbourhoods were demolished. New apartment compounds were built in standardised layouts. The population reached its peak. What caused this transformation? Some scholars argued it was a political revolution, a shift from rule by an elite class to governance by a more collective or bureaucratic system. This would explain the absence of royal imagery in the art. Teotihuacan, they suggested, may have been governed by a council of priests or merchants or neighbourhood representatives, a form of government unique in Mesoamerica. Others proposed that the transformation was religious, the result of a new cult or prophecy that swept through the city, inspiring a wave of construction and attracting new migrants. Still others suggested environmental factors. Perhaps a drought or volcanic eruption had disrupted the old order, forcing a reorganization of society. Perhaps the city had grown so large that traditional governance structures could no longer function, necessitating innovation. The most contentious debate concerns the end of Teotihuacan. Around 750 AD, the city was burned, not by accident, not by invaders, or at least not invaders alone. The burning was systematic, focused on the temples and elite compounds along the Avenue of the Dead. The residential areas were largely spared. This pattern suggested internal conflict, a rebellion or revolution. Some scholars argue that the lower classes rose up against the elite, destroying the symbols of power and forcing the rulers to flee. Others suggest a religious conflict, rival cults battling for control, burning each other's temples in a purge. A minority view proposes that the burning was intentional but not violent, a ritual closure, a deliberate act to decommission the city, perhaps because of environmental degradation or the failure of the rains, a way to end the city's life with dignity rather than let it decay. The truth is, we do not know. We may never know. The people of Teotihuacan left no written records to explain their motives. The archaeology is ambiguous. Every theory has evidence to support it and evidence against it. And so the debates continue. At conferences and in academic journals, scholars present new findings, new interpretations, new models of how Teotihuacan functioned and why it fell. Some debates are cordial, others are fierce. Careers are made and lost on competing theories. But beneath all the disagreement, there is consensus on one point. Teotihuacan was extraordinary. It was a city unlike any other in Mesoamerica, perhaps unlike any other in the ancient world. It represented an experiment in urban living, in collective identity, in the possibilities of what humans could build when they work together toward a common vision. The theories will continue to evolve. New excavations will bring new evidence, new technologies, ground-penetrating radar, isotope analysis, DNA studies will reveal details previous generations could never have imagined. But the core mystery will likely remain, because Teotihuacan, in the end, is not just a puzzle to be solved. It is a mirror in which we see our own assumptions about power, about religion, about what makes a civilization great. And like all good mirrors, it reflects back questions as much as answers. The work of uncovering Teotihuacan's story has been slow, methodical, often frustrating. Unlike Egyptian tombs with their hieroglyphic inscriptions or Mesopotamian cities with their cuneiform tablets, Teotihuacan offers no easy narrative. Every fact must be wrestled from the earth, interpreted from fragments, pieced together like a shattered mosaic. Modern archaeology at Teotihuacan began in earnest in the 1960s and 70s, when a new generation of researchers, armed with better tools and stricter methodologies, returned to the site with fresh questions. They were no longer content to simply excavate pyramids. They wanted to understand the city as a living organism, to reconstruct the daily lives of its inhabitants, to trace the flow of goods and people through its streets. One of the most ambitious projects was the Teotihuacan Mapping Project, led by René Milon. Starting in 1962, Milon and his team spent years surveying every visible structure in the ancient city, creating detailed maps that revealed the true extent of Teotihuacan's urban sprawl. They documented more than 2,000 apartment compounds, hundreds of workshops, dozens of temples and plazas. What they found astonished them. The city covered more than 20 square kilometres. It was laid out in a precise grid, with the Avenue of the Dead as its central axis and smaller streets branching off at right angles. Every building, no matter how humble, conformed to the grid. There was no organic growth here, no haphazard expansion. Someone had planned this city, had imposed order on the landscape with an iron will. The mapping project also revealed patterns of segregation. Certain neighborhoods were wealthy, their compounds decorated with murals and filled with imported goods. Other neighborhoods were modest, working-class areas where obsidian was knapped or pottery was fired. And there were foreign enclaves, entire districts where migrants from Oaxaca, or the Maya lowlands or the Gulf Coast had settled, maintaining their own distinct architectural styles and burial practices, even as they participated in the life of the city. This discovery challenged the notion that Teotihuacan was ethnically homogeneous. It was instead a cosmopolitan metropolis, a melting pot where people from across Mesoamerica came to live and work. But how did they govern themselves? How did they organize such a massive population? To answer this, archaeologists turned to the residential compounds. These multifamily apartment buildings housed anywhere from 60 to 100 people, likely extended families or groups of related kin. Each compound was built around a central courtyard, with rooms arranged symmetrically, with drainage systems and shared spaces that suggested a high degree of cooperation. Some compounds showed evidence of feasting, large hearths where communal meals were prepared, serving vessels enough for dozens of people. This suggested that important decisions may have been made collectively, that governance happened at the neighborhood level rather than being imposed from above. Others' compounds contained workshops. In one, archaeologists found thousands of obsidian blades in various stages of production. In another, they found kilns for firing pottery. In yet another, they found pigments and grinding stones used to make paint for murals. These craft specialists were not slaves or servants. They were skilled workers, possibly organized into guilds, producing goods for trade and tribute. The investigation deepened with advances in technology. Radiocarbon dating allowed archaeologists to establish precise timelines for different phases of construction. They discovered that the city had been built in spurts, with major building campaigns in the 1st and 4th centuries AD. They learned that the Pyramid of the Sun had been constructed around 100 AD, making it contemporary with the Roman Colosseum. Chemical analysis of pottery and obsidian revealed trade networks stretching across Mesoamerica. Obsidian from Teotihuacan workshops has been found in Maya cities more than 1,000 kilometers away. Cacao, which does not grow in the highland valleys, arrived from the tropical lowlands, evidence of long-distance exchange. DNA analysis of human remains provided another piece of the puzzle. The people buried at Teotihuacan were genetically diverse, reflecting migrations from multiple regions. Some showed signs of childhood, malnutrition, suggesting that life in the city was not equally prosperous for all. Others bore evidence of ritual dental modification or cranial shaping, practices associated with elite status in Mesoamerican cultures. Isotope analysis of teeth revealed where people had been born. Surprisingly, many residents of Teotihuacan had grown up elsewhere and migrated to the city as adults. This suggested that Teotihuacan's growth was driven not just by natural population increase, but by immigration, by people drawn to the opportunities and prestige of the great city. One of the most dramatic discoveries came in 2003, when archaeologists exploring beneath the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, a pyramid adorned with massive stone serpent heads, uncovered a tunnel. It had been sealed around 1800 years ago, deliberately filled with rubble and forgotten. Using remote-controlled robots equipped with cameras, researchers explored the tunnel. It stretched more than 100 meters beneath the pyramid, ending in a series of chambers. Inside, they found offerings, jade figures, rubber balls, shells from distant oceans, and evidence of Mercury, a substance sacred to Mesoamerican peoples, liquid silver that reflected like water. The tunnel may have been a symbolic underworld, a recreation of the mythical place from which life emerged. Or it may have been a royal tomb, the final resting place of Teotihuacan's rulers, though no burials have yet been found. The investigation continues. Every season brings new excavations, new analyses, new interpretations. Archaeologists use ground-penetrating radar to locate buried structures without digging. They use LiDAR to map the surrounding landscape, searching for roads and agricultural fields. They use 3D modeling to reconstruct murals and buildings. But the investigation is not just about technology. It is about patience, about sitting with ambiguity, about accepting that some questions may never be answered. It is about respecting the people of Teotihuacan enough to let them remain mysterious, to resist the urge to impose simple narratives on their complex lives. The truth is being pieced together, fragment by fragment, but it will never be complete, and perhaps that is fitting. Because Teotihuacan was a city of layers, of hidden tunnels and sealed chambers, of secrets buried beneath secrets. To uncover it all would be to destroy the mystery, and the mystery is part of the truth. The physical remnants of Teotihuacan speak in fragments, in shards of pottery and obsidian blades, in murals faded but still luminous, in offerings buried beneath floors and pyramids. These are the pieces from which archaeologists reconstruct an entire civilization, reading meaning into objects that were once mundane, once part of the everyday rhythm of life. One of the most revealing categories of evidence is pottery. Thousands of ceramic vessels have been recovered from Teotihuacan, ranging from simple cooking pots to elaborate incense burners shaped like temples. The pottery is distinctive, thin-walled and often covered in a fine orange or brown slip, decorated with geometric patterns or images of gods. What makes Teotihuacan pottery particularly valuable is its distribution. The same styles appear across Mesoamerica, from the Gulf Coast to the Maya highlands, evidence of trade or influence or perhaps the movement of Teotihuacan merchants, establishing outposts in distant cities. When archaeologists find a Teotihuacan-style vessel in a Maya tomb, they know that these two cultures were in contact, that ideas and goods flowed between them. But pottery tells us more than just trade routes. The clay itself holds information. Chemical analysis can determine where the clay was sourced, revealing whether a pot was made locally or imported. Residue analysis can detect what the pot once held, cacao or maize or pulque, that fermented drink made from agave. Even the fingerprints of the potter sometimes survive, pressed into the wet clay 2,000 years ago, a ghost of a hand that shaped the vessel. Obsidian is another crucial piece of evidence. This volcanic glass, sharper than any metal blade, was Teotihuacan's most important resource. The city controlled obsidian sources at Pachuca and Otumba, quarries where green and grey stone could be mined and worked into tools, weapons and ritual objects. Archaeologists have found obsidian workshops throughout Teotihuacan, rooms filled with debris from blade production, thousands of tiny flakes left behind as craftsmen knapped cores into prismatic blades. The skill required was extraordinary. A single core could yield dozens of blades, each one razor-sharp, each one essentially identical to the others. These blades were not just tools, they were currency, traded across vast distances, valued as highly as jade or cacao. A Teotihuacan blade found in a Maya city was not just an object, it was a connection, a thread linking two worlds. The murals provide the richest evidence of Teotihuacan's culture. More than 100 mural programs have been discovered, painted on the walls of temples, palaces, and apartment compounds. They depict a world of astonishing complexity and beauty. In one mural, a procession of priests moves along a path carrying offerings. They wear elaborate headdresses adorned with quetzal feathers and jade. Their bodies are painted or tattooed. From their mouths emerge scrolls, speech or song represented visually, words we can never hear. In another, Tlaloc presides over a ritual. Water streams from his hands. Beneath him, crops grow abundantly. The message is clear. The gods provide, but the gods must be honoured. A third mural shows jaguars and coyotes, predators of the Mexican highlands, moving through fields of maize and flowers. Are they symbols of warrior orders? Representations of clans or lineages? We can only guess. What is remarkable about these murals is their preservation. The pigments, made from minerals and plants, have survived because the buildings were buried, sealed from light and air. When archaeologists expose them, they often work at night or in dim light, photographing and documenting before the colours begin to fade. The murals also reveal something about social structure. The grandest paintings are found in compounds near the Avenue of the Dead, in elite residences where the wealthy lived. But even modest compounds have murals, simpler designs, geometric patterns or images of everyday life. Art was not reserved for the elite, it permeated the city. Burial offerings provide another window into belief and practice. When Teotihuacanos died, they were often interred beneath the floors of their homes, their bodies accompanied by objects they might need in the afterlife. Pottery vessels held food and drink. Obsidian blades provided protection. Jade beads symbolized breath and life. Some burials are elaborate. In the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, archaeologists uncovered mass burials containing more than 200 individuals, many of them young men with their hands bound behind their backs. They had been sacrificed, likely as part of the temple's dedication ceremony, offered to the gods to sanctify the pyramid. Other burials are simple, a single body wrapped in a mat, accompanied by a few pots, a testament to a life lived without wealth or power. Even the architecture itself is evidence. The alignment of buildings to celestial events, the use of standardized measurements, the incorporation of symbolism into design, all reveal a sophisticated understanding of astronomy and geometry. The Pyramid of the Sun, for example, is oriented so that the sun sets directly in front of it on 2 days of the year, marking the transition between agricultural seasons. The drainage systems, the use of tallad tablero architectural style, the construction of multi-story apartment buildings all demonstrate engineering knowledge that rivals anything in the ancient world. And then there are the objects of daily life. Stone metates for grinding maize, spindle whorls for spinning thread, clay figurines of people and animals, perhaps toys or ritual objects, bone needles, shell ornaments, the ordinary things that tell us how people lived, what they ate, how they dressed, what they valued. One particularly poignant artifact is a child's toy, a small clay dog with wheels. It is one of the few wheeled objects ever found in Mesoamerica, proof that the concept of the wheel was known but not used for transportation, perhaps because there were no draft animals to pull carts. Each piece of evidence is a fragment of a lost world. Individually, they tell us little. A potsherd is just a potsherd. An obsidian blade is just a tool. But together, assembled with care and interpreted with humility, they begin to form a picture. Not a complete picture. Never that. But enough to glimpse the outlines of a civilization, to sense the rhythms of its life, to honor the people who built it. The evidence does not give us names. It does not give us their language or their stories, but it gives us something perhaps more valuable. It gives us proof that they existed, that they mattered, that they created beauty and order in a chaotic world. The fragments of Teotihuacan are all that remain, but they are enough to ensure that the city will never be truly lost. Beneath the obvious mysteries of Teotihuacan, who built it, who ruled it, why it fell, there lies a deeper enigma, one that archaeologists grapple with every time they confront the evidence. It is the mystery of anonymity. Teotihuacan is unique among ancient civilizations in its refusal to glorify individuals. There are no statues of kings, no inscriptions naming rulers, no monuments celebrating dynasties. The city that housed over 100,000 people, that dominated Mesoamerica for centuries, left behind no record of who led it. This is strange, this is unprecedented, and it suggests something profound about how Teotihuacan was organized. In Egypt, pharaohs plastered their names across temples. In Mesopotamia, kings boasted of their conquests on clay tablets. In the Maya cities, rulers erected stelae recording their births, their accessions, their victories in war. Even in smaller Mesoamerican cities, leaders left their mark, carved glyphs or portraits that ensured their memory would endure. But not in Teotihuacan. Some scholars have suggested that Teotihuacan was governed by a council, a collective leadership that shared power rather than concentrating it in a single person. This would explain the absence of royal imagery. There were no individuals to glorify because no individual held supreme power. Others propose that Teotihuacan was a theocracy, ruled by priests who saw themselves as servants of the gods, rather than rulers in their own right. In this model, the priests would have wielded enormous influence, but they would not have sought personal fame. The glory belonged to the gods, not to mortals. A third possibility is that Teotihuacan experienced a political revolution early in its history, overthrowing an earlier system of kingship and deliberately erasing all traces of individual rulers. The lack of royal iconography would then be a political statement, a declaration that no one person should be elevated above the community. Whatever the truth, the anonymity is deliberate. It is not an accident of preservation. Other Mesoamerican cities had their monuments destroyed, their inscriptions defaced, but traces always remain. At Teotihuacan, there is nothing. No trace of royal names, no hint of dynastic succession. This anonymity extends to the art. The murals show priests and ritual participants, but their faces are often masked or stylized. They are types, not individuals. The message seems to be that the role matters more than the person. The ritual is collective, not personal. Even the burials reflect this. While some graves contain rich offerings, none can be definitively identified as royal tombs. There is no Teotihuacan equivalent of Tutankhamun's tomb, no burial so lavish that it could only belong to a king. The deeper mystery goes beyond politics. It touches on identity itself. Who were the Teotihuacanos? Not just socially, but ethnically, linguistically, culturally. The city was multi-ethnic. We know this from pottery styles, from burial practices, from the presence of foreign enclaves. But we do not know which group founded Teotihuacan, which language was spoken in the temples, which traditions were considered native and which imported. Linguistic analysis offers few clues. The later Aztecs spoke Nahuatl, but there is no evidence that this was the language of Teotihuacan. Some scholars propose Totonac, others Otomi, still others suggest a language that has since gone extinct, leaving no modern descendants. The absence of writing makes this question impossible to answer definitively. We have no text to analyze, no inscriptions to translate. The language of Teotihuacan died with its last speakers, and then there is the question of what they called themselves. Teotihuacan is an Aztec name, imposed centuries after the city was abandoned. It means place where gods were born, or perhaps place where one becomes a god. But it is not the original name. The people who built the city surely had a name for it, a name spoken daily, painted on murals, invoked in prayers. But that name is lost. We will never know what they called their home. This anonymity extends even to the gods. While we recognize figures that resemble later deities, Tlaloc with his goggle eyes, the feathered serpent with its fangs and plumes, we cannot be certain that these were their names in Teotihuacan. The gods may have had different attributes, different myths, different rituals. The Aztecs projected their own religion onto Teotihuacan, assuming that the ruins they found had been dedicated to the gods they worshipped. But this may be wrong. The religion of Teotihuacan may have been distinct, its cosmology different, its practices unique. Some murals hint at beliefs that do not align with later Mesoamerican traditions. One painting shows a figure scattering seeds or stars from its hands, surrounded by imagery that suggests creation or abundance. Is this a god, a priest, a mythological scene? We cannot say. Another mural depicts a paradise, a place of dancing and singing, where people play in flower-filled gardens beneath a great tree. Is this the afterlife? A memory of a golden age? A symbolic representation of the city itself? Again, we do not know. The deeper mystery of Teotihuacan is that it resists our attempts to know it fully. It gives us architecture and artifacts, murals and pottery, but it withholds the keys to interpretation. It shows us what was built, but not why. It reveals daily life, but not the beliefs that gave that life meaning. This is frustrating for archaeologists, but it is also humbling. It reminds us that there are limits to what we can recover from the past, that some knowledge is irretrievably lost, that the ancient world contains mysteries we will never solve, and perhaps this is appropriate. Perhaps Teotihuacan's anonymity is not a flaw in the archaeological record, but a deliberate choice, a statement by its builders that the community mattered more than the individual, that the work mattered more than the worker, that the city mattered more than any single name. In our modern world, we are obsessed with attribution, with credit, with ensuring that individuals are recognized for their achievements. But Teotihuacan suggests another way, a civilization that built grandly, artistically, powerfully, without needing to carve its heroes into stone. The deeper mystery is not just what they never told us, it is why they chose silence. Around 400 AD, Teotihuacan reached the peak of its power. The city stretched across the valley floor, its pyramids visible from miles away, its population swelling to perhaps 125,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the world at that time. This was the Golden Age, the moment when everything the city had worked toward for 4 centuries came to fruition. The Pyramid of the Sun stood complete, its terraces gleaming with fresh plaster. The Pyramid of the Moon anchored the northern end of the Avenue of the Dead. The Temple of the Feathered Serpent, its facade adorned with massive serpent heads and warrior imagery, proclaimed the city's power. But with this peak came transformation. Something changed in Teotihuacan around this time, something so fundamental that it reshaped the entire city. Archaeological evidence suggests a massive urban renewal project. Old neighborhoods were demolished. New apartment compounds were built in standardized designs, each following the same basic layout, a central courtyard surrounded by rooms with porticos and drainage systems. Thousands of people were relocated, moved from haphazard settlements into these planned communities. This was not gradual growth. This was deliberate reorganization on a scale rarely seen in the ancient world. It suggests strong central authority, the ability to mobilize labor and resources, to impose a vision on the entire city. But it also suggests something else: crisis. Why would a city at the height of its power undertake such dramatic restructuring? What prompted this transformation? Some scholars point to environmental factors. Around this time, the Valley of Mexico experienced changes in rainfall patterns. Springs that had fed the city for centuries may have begun to dry up. Agricultural productivity may have declined. The city may have faced a choice: adapt or decline. The urban renewal could have been a response, a way to concentrate population, to make water distribution more efficient, to create a more sustainable urban form. The new apartment compounds had sophisticated drainage systems, suggesting careful management of precious water resources. Others suggest political revolution. Perhaps the old elite had failed, unable to provide for the city's needs. Perhaps a new faction seized power, one that emphasized collective welfare over individual privilege. The demolition of old elite residences and their replacement with standardized housing would fit this narrative. The absence of royal imagery in Teotihuacan's art becomes particularly significant in this context. If there had been kings in the early period, they left no trace. But around 400 AD, when the city transformed, the silence about rulers became even more pronounced. The new murals emphasized religious themes, community rituals, gods rather than men. This suggests that the transformation may have been ideological as well as physical. Perhaps Teotihuacan underwent a religious reformation, a shift in beliefs that demanded new forms of organization, new ways of living. The evidence is tantalizing but ambiguous. In some demolished structures, archaeologists have found signs of burning, suggesting violence or at least deliberate destruction. In others, the dismantling seems methodical, careful, as if buildings were being respectfully retired rather than destroyed in anger. Whatever the cause, the result was a city transformed. The new Teotihuacan was more orderly, more planned, more communal. Neighborhoods were integrated, mixing people from different backgrounds rather than segregating them by origin or status. Craft production was organized more efficiently, with entire compounds dedicated to specific industries. The city's influence expanded during this period. Teotihuacan-style ceramics and architecture appeared at sites across Mesoamerica. At the Maya city of Tikal, iconography depicting Teotihuacan warriors appears in the year 378 AD, suggesting some kind of intervention or alliance. Whether this was conquest, trade, or religious pilgrimage remains debated, but Teotihuacan's presence was felt far beyond the Valley of Mexico. The city became a magnet for migrants. People came from the Gulf Coast, from Oaxaca, from the Maya regions, drawn by economic opportunity or religious significance. They brought their traditions with them, but they also adopted Teotihuacan ways, creating a hybrid culture that was cosmopolitan and distinctive. The turning point was not a single event. It was a process, a transformation that unfolded over decades. But by 450 AD, the new Teotihuacan was fully realized. The city had been remade, and yet, even at this peak, there were hints of fragility. The urban renewal, for all its ambition, may have disrupted traditional social structures. The relocation of populations may have created tensions. The standardization of housing may have been experienced as oppression by some, even if it was intended as equity. The city's growth had pushed the limits of what the environment could support. The forests on the surrounding hills had been cleared for fuel and construction. The springs were overtaxed. The soil was eroding. Teotihuacan was magnificent, but it was also vulnerable. In the murals from this period, there is a tension. On one hand, images of abundance, of paradise gardens, of rituals performed in harmony. On the other hand, imagery of weapons, of warriors, of gods who demanded sacrifice. It is as if the city was trying to hold together contradictory forces, to balance growth with sustainability, order with freedom, the sacred with the profane. The turning point that brought Teotihuacan to its peak also contained the seeds of its eventual decline. The very success of the city created pressures that would, in time prove unsustainable. The urban renewal that made Teotihuacan more efficient also made it more rigid. The centralization that brought order also concentrated risk. For now, in 400 AD, these problems were manageable. The city thrived. The markets buzzed with activity. The pyramids drew pilgrims from across Mesoamerica. The workshops produced obsidian blades by the thousands. The farmers brought in harvests from the terraced fields. Teotihuacan had reached the height of its power. What came next would test whether that power could be sustained. The city had changed everything. Soon, everything would change the city. For 3 centuries after the Great Transformation, Teotihuacan endured. The city that had remade itself around 400 AD continued to function, its markets filled with traders, its temples thick with incense smoke, its workshops producing obsidian blades that travelled to the farthest corners of Mesoamerica. But by 700 AD, something was changing. The archaeological record shows subtle shifts, small cracks in the foundation of the great city. Trade networks began to contract. Fewer exotic goods arrived from distant regions. The flow of cacao from the lowlands slowed. Jade became scarcer. The city that had once drawn the world to itself was becoming more isolated, more insular. At the same time, there is evidence of increasing militarization. Fortifications appeared at sites on Teotihuacan's periphery, suggesting threats from outside or perhaps the need to control territory more aggressively. Warrior imagery became more prominent in art. Weapons appeared more frequently in burials. The murals from this late period are darker in tone. Paradise gardens give way to images of sacrifice and warfare. The gods appear more demanding, their open hands now holding hearts, their benevolent expressions replaced by fierce masks. Something was wrong. The climate may have been changing, becoming drier, making agriculture more difficult. The population may have outstripped the land's ability to support it. Political tensions may have been building, factions competing for control as resources grew scarce. Or perhaps the problem was spiritual. Perhaps the people had lost faith in the system, in the rituals that promised rain and abundance in the leaders who claimed to speak for the gods. Around 750 AD, the consequences of these pressures came to a head. Fire swept through the city, not everywhere, but focused on the ceremonial core, on the temples and elite compounds that lined the Avenue of the Dead. The burning was systematic. The Temple of the Feathered Serpent was torched. The residential compounds of the wealthy were set ablaze. The fire was hot enough to crack stone, to char wooden beams, to melt the plaster that had covered the walls. But here is what is strange. The fire did not touch the residential neighbourhoods. The apartment compounds where ordinary people lived remained largely intact. The workshops continued to function, at least for a while. This was not random destruction. This was targeted. Who set the fires? Invaders from outside, rival cities taking advantage of Teotihuacan's weakness, or revolutionaries from within, the city's own people rising up against the elite? The evidence suggests internal conflict. There are no mass graves, no signs of the kind of slaughter that accompanies foreign conquest. The burning seems ritualistic, deliberate, as if certain structures were being decommissioned, their power symbolically destroyed. Perhaps this was a revolution, a popular uprising that overthrew the old order. Perhaps the people of Teotihuacan, tired of inequality, tired of supporting a priestly elite, decided to burn down the symbols of power and start anew. Or perhaps it was a religious conflict, rival cults battling for supremacy, each side trying to destroy the sacred sites of the other. In this scenario, the burning would have been an act of purification, a way to cleanse the city of false beliefs. A third possibility is environmental desperation. If the rains had failed, if the crops had withered, the people may have blamed the priests, may have decided that the old gods had abandoned them, and that new rituals, new leaders, were needed. The burning would then be a last-ditch attempt to appease the divine, to sacrifice even the temples themselves in hopes of renewal. Whatever the cause, the consequence was abandonment. After the fires, the population of Teotihuacan began to decline. Not all at once, the city did not empty overnight, but gradually, over decades, people left. Some migrated to other cities. Teotihuacan pottery styles appear at distant sites during this period, suggesting that refugees carried their traditions with them. Others may have returned to the countryside, abandoning urban life for the simpler existence of farming villages. By 800 AD, Teotihuacan was no longer a city. It was a town a shadow of its former self, with perhaps 10,000 inhabitants clinging to the ruins of a civilization they barely remembered. By 900 AD, it was nearly empty. The Great Avenue was silent. The pyramids stood unattended. The murals faded behind crumbling walls. The city that had once housed more people than Rome was returning to the earth. The fall of Teotihuacan sent ripples across Mesoamerica. Cities that had depended on trade with Teotihuacan had to find new partners. Political alliances that had been anchored by Teotihuacan's influence dissolved. Religious practices that had spread from Teotihuacan began to fragment, to adapt to local traditions. But the fall also created opportunities. With Teotihuacan's collapse, other cities rose. The Maya city-states grew more independent, more confident. New powers emerged in central Mexico, ancestors of the Toltecs and eventually the Aztecs, building on the ruins of what Teotihuacan had created. In some ways, the fall was not an ending but a dispersal. The people of Teotihuacan did not vanish. They scattered, carrying their knowledge and traditions with them. They became weavers and potters in other cities, priests in other temples, farmers in other valleys. The consequences of Teotihuacan's fall were both immediate and long-term. Immediately there was disruption, the collapse of trade networks, the loss of a centre that had organised much of Mesoamerican life. But over time, the fall made space for new civilizations to emerge, for new ideas to take root. And the city itself, even in ruin, remained significant. Later peoples continued to visit, to leave offerings, to revere the place where gods had once been born. The physical city declined, but the mythic city endured. The consequence of Teotihuacan's rise had been the transformation of Mesoamerica, the creation of a cosmopolitan centre that influenced art, religion, and politics across a vast region. The consequence of its fall was equally transformative, a redistribution of power, a fragmentation that allowed diversity to flourish. Both rise and fall were necessary. Both shaped the world that came after. Teotihuacan's story is not tragedy or triumph. It is both, woven together, inseparable. The city had reached too high, and in reaching, it had changed everything. Even in falling, it continued to change the world. Teotihuacan's influence did not end with its abandonment. The city left a legacy that shaped Mesoamerican civilization for centuries, echoes that can still be detected today. The most obvious impact was architectural. The talud tablero style, a distinctive pattern of sloped panels and vertical frames, became widespread across Mesoamerica. Cities hundreds of miles from Teotihuacan adopted this design, building temples and platforms that mimicked the Great Pyramids of the Valley of Mexico. The Maya, in particular, were profoundly influenced by Teotihuacan. At Tikal, Copan, and other major cities, structures built in the 4th and 5th centuries show clear Teotihuacan characteristics. The Mayas did not simply copy, they adapted, blending Teotihuacan elements with their own traditions to create something new. This architectural influence suggests more than casual contact. It implies sustained interaction, perhaps trade missions, perhaps diplomatic marriages, perhaps even military alliances or interventions. The exact nature of the relationship remains debated, but the impact is undeniable. Religious ideas also spread from Teotihuacan. The worship of the feathered serpent and the storm god became central to Mesoamerican spirituality. While these deities may have existed in earlier forms, their iconography was codified at Teotihuacan, standardized in murals and sculptures that were then replicated across the region. The concept of the sacred city, the urban center as a place where the divine manifests, likely originated or at least crystallized at Teotihuacan. Later Mesoamerican cities, from Tula to Tenochtitlan, were conceived as cosmic centers, places where heaven and earth met, an idea that Teotihuacan exemplified. Even the Aztec practice of human sacrifice, often viewed as uniquely Aztec, has roots in Teotihuacan. The mass burials at the Temple of the Feathered Serpent show that sacrificial rituals were performed on a large scale. While the Aztecs would take this practice to extremes, they were building on a tradition established centuries earlier. Trade networks created by Teotihuacan persisted long after the city fell. Obsidian from the Pachuca and Otumba sources continued to circulate throughout Mesoamerica. The routes established by Teotihuacan merchants became highways for later traders, connecting the Gulf Coast to the Pacific, the Maya lowlands to the northern deserts. The standardization of weights and measures, the development of long-distance trade protocols, the establishment of marketplaces as central institutions, all innovations associated with Teotihuacan became fundamental to Mesoamerican economic life. Perhaps most significantly, Teotihuacan demonstrated what was possible. It proved that Mesoamerican peoples could create cities rivaling those of the Old World, that they could organize societies of enormous complexity, that they could build monuments for the ages. This was not obvious before Teotihuacan. The Olmecs had created impressive ceremonial centers, but nothing on this scale. Teotihuacan showed that urbanization was achievable, that tens of thousands of people could live together, work together, create together. Later civilizations looked to Teotihuacan as a model, sometimes literally. When the Aztecs built Tenochtitlan, they oriented their main temple complex to echo the layout of Teotihuacan. They made pilgrimages to the ancient ruins, seeking legitimacy by connecting themselves to the sacred past. The Aztec claim that they were the cultural heirs of Teotihuacan was both true and false. True, because they adopted many Teotihuacan practices and beliefs. False, because they misunderstood the city, projecting their own values onto ruins they could not fully interpret. But this misunderstanding itself had impact. By venerating Teotihuacan, the Aztecs ensured that the city would be remembered, that its ruins would be preserved, that its story, however, distorted, would survive the Spanish conquest. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in 1519, they heard Aztec tales of Teotihuacan. They visited the ruins and marvelled, though they too misunderstood, imagining that perhaps Romans or Carthaginians had built the pyramids, unable to accept that indigenous people could have achieved such greatness. Teotihuacan's impact extends even to the modern world. The excavation and restoration of the site in the 20th century became a source of national pride for Mexico, a symbol of indigenous achievement that countered centuries of colonial erasure. The pyramids appear on currency, in textbooks, in tourist promotions. They are a pilgrimage site for modern visitors, not for religious reasons, but for the awe they inspire, the sense of connection to a distant past. For archaeologists, Teotihuacan revolutionized understanding of pre-Columbian civilization. It demonstrated that complex societies could arise without certain traits long considered essential, without writing, without the wheel, without metal tools. It forced a re-evaluation of what defines a civilization. The city also raised questions about governance and social organization. Its apparent lack of individual rulers challenged assumptions about power, suggesting that ancient societies could function without kings or emperors, that collective leadership was viable on a large scale. These are not abstract academic questions. They have implications for how we think about human societies today, about alternatives to hierarchical power structures, about the relationship between equality and efficiency, about whether large-scale organization requires authoritarian control. Teotihuacan suggests that the answer is no, that a city of 100,000 people can function without glorifying individual leaders, that monumental achievements can be collective rather than personal. This is Teotihuacan's deepest impact, not just the temples it built or the trade routes it established, but the idea it represents, the possibility it proves, that ordinary people working together can create something extraordinary, that a city can be great without kings, that achievement can be measured in community rather than conquest. The stones of Teotihuacan are silent now, but their impact echoes through the centuries, shaping how we understand our past and imagine our future. Behind the pyramids and the murals, behind the grand narrative of rise and fall, there were people. Not abstractions, not statistics, but individuals who woke each morning, worked through the day, and fell asleep under the same stars we see tonight. Their names are lost. We will never know what a potter called her daughter, what a priest whispered in prayer, what a merchant joked about in the market. But we can glimpse their lives through the objects they left behind, the homes they inhabited, the choices they made. Consider a woman who lived around 400 AD in a residential compound near the western edge of the city. We know she was there because archaeologists found her skeleton, buried beneath the floor of her home. She was approximately 30 years old when she died. Her teeth show patterns of wear consistent with preparing maize, grinding corn on a matate day after day until the enamel wore thin. Analysis of her bones reveals periods of nutritional stress during childhood. She likely experienced hunger, perhaps during a drought or a failed harvest. But she survived, growing into adulthood in a city that, despite its grandeur, could not always feed all its children. Beside her skeleton, archaeologists found a spindle whorl, a clay disc used to spin thread. This was probably her tool, something she used daily to create the cloth that would become garments or offerings. In her hands, simple fibre became something useful, something valuable. This woman was not elite. Her burial contained no jade, no elaborate pottery, but she was part of Teotihuacan, part of the community that made the city function. Without her and thousands like her, spinning thread, grinding corn, raising children, the pyramids would never have been built. Now consider a young man buried in the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, one of the 200 sacrificed when the pyramid was dedicated. He was perhaps 20 years old. His bones show evidence of good nutrition, better than the woman at the edge of the city. He may have been selected for sacrifice precisely because he was healthy, because he represented the best the city could offer to the gods. His hands were bound behind his back with cord. He was dressed in warrior regalia, adorned with ornaments carved from shell and obsidian. He did not die alone. He was surrounded by others, all young men, all sacrificed together in a mass ritual meant to sanctify the temple. Did he go willingly? Did he believe that his death would ensure rain, would guarantee the city's prosperity? Or did he struggle? Did he cry out? Did he curse the priests who held the blade? We cannot know. But his sacrifice was not meaningless to those who performed it. It was an act of profound significance, a gift to the gods, a transaction that, in their cosmology, maintained the balance of the universe. Then there is the merchant, a man whose grave was found in an elite compound near the Avenue of the Dead. He was buried with items from across Mesoamerica, pottery from the Gulf Coast, jade from Guatemala, shells from the Pacific Ocean. These objects tell us he travelled widely, that he connected Teotihuacan to distant places. He likely walked for weeks at a time, leading porters carrying obsidian blades to trade in Maya cities. He negotiated in languages he had learned, adapted to foreign customs, ate unfamiliar food. He brought back not just goods, but stories, news of other cities, other ways of living. Through him and merchants like him, Teotihuacan remained connected to the wider world. He was a translator, a diplomat, a bridge between cultures. His voice is silent now, but his journey shaped the city's understanding of itself. There were also children, of course. Archaeologists have found toy figurines, clay animals with movable limbs, miniature pots and grinding stones that allowed children to mimic adult work. They played in the courtyards of apartment compounds, chased each other along the Avenue of the Dead, learned the rhythms of ritual and labour that would define their lives. Some died young. Infant mortality was high in the ancient world. Their tiny skeletons are found beneath floors, often in corners of rooms, close to where their mothers worked. They were mourned, buried with care, remembered. And there were elders, people who survived to old age, a rarity in a world without modern medicine. Their bones show arthritis, broken bones that healed imperfectly, the wear and tear of decades of labour. But they survived, and their survival meant something. They were repositories of memory, keepers of tradition, links to the past. One such elder, a woman buried with obsidian blades and pottery vessels, may have been a midwife or healer. Her grave goods suggest ritual knowledge, practical skills passed down through generations. She brought children into the world, eased the dying out of it, mediated between life and death. These are the forgotten voices of Teotihuacan. They did not commission murals or build pyramids. They did not leave inscriptions recording their deeds. But they lived, they loved, they worked, they hoped. The woman who spun thread may have watched the sun set behind the Pyramid of the Sun and felt awe at what her community had built. The young man sacrificed at the temple may have walked through the city one last time and felt pride, even in fear, at being chosen. The merchant may have stood in a distant marketplace and felt homesick for Teotihuacan's familiar streets. The elder midwife may have held a newborn and whispered blessings in a language we will never hear. Their humanity is the city's truest legacy. Not the stones, though the stones are magnificent. Not the trade networks or the architectural innovations or the religious influence. But the fact that here, in this valley, people chose to live together, to build together, to create something larger than themselves. They were not perfect. Their society had inequality, had violence, had failures. But they tried. They built a city that endured for centuries. They created art that still moves us. They organized themselves in ways we are still trying to understand. The voices are forgotten, but the echo of their lives, the trace of their presence, remains in every potsherd, every mural fragment, every stone of the Great Pyramids. They were Teotihuacanos, and they mattered. Not everyone in Teotihuacan was content. Not everyone accepted the city's vision, its rules, its demands. In every society there are those who resist, who question, who push back against authority. Finding evidence of resistance in ancient societies is difficult. The powerful write history, or in Teotihuacan's case, paint murals and build monuments. The voices of dissent are usually silenced, erased from the record. But archaeology sometimes reveals what was meant to be hidden, and at Teotihuacan there are hints of opposition, subtle signs of conflict beneath the surface of apparent order. The foreign enclaves are one place to look, neighborhoods where migrants from Oaxaca or the Maya regions or the Gulf Coast settled, maintaining their own distinctive traditions. These communities participated in Teotihuacan's economy, traded in the city's markets, but they also kept themselves apart. Their pottery remained distinct. Their burial practices differed from the Teotihuacan norm. They organized their compounds differently, arranged their rooms in patterns that reflected their own cultural traditions, rather than the city's standardized layouts. This was a form of resistance, quiet perhaps, but real. A refusal to fully assimilate, to surrender cultural identity in exchange for participation in the city's life. By maintaining their traditions, these communities asserted that Teotihuacan's way was not the only way. There is also evidence of economic resistance. Not all craft production was centralized. Some workshops operated independently, producing goods for local consumption rather than for long-distance trade. These artisans may have rejected the pressure to participate in the city's export economy, choosing instead to serve their immediate community. Religious resistance is harder to detect, but there are clues. Some residential compounds contain altars that do not match the iconography found in the great temples. They honor different gods or honor familiar gods in unfamiliar ways. This suggests that official religion did not fully penetrate domestic spaces, that families maintained their own practices, their own beliefs. The burning of the city around 750 AD is the most dramatic evidence of resistance. The systematic destruction of temples and elite compounds suggests organized opposition, a movement powerful enough to challenge the existing order. Who were these opponents? The most common theory is that they were the lower classes, people who had grown tired of supporting an elite that demanded tribute and labor, but offered little in return. The apartment compounds remained intact while the temples burned, suggesting that the revolutionaries were ordinary residents, not foreign invaders. But another possibility is that the opposition came from within the elite itself, rival factions competing for control. Perhaps there were competing priesthoods, each claiming legitimacy, each accusing the other of false worship. The burning would then represent one faction's victory over another, a purge of heretics or political enemies. A third scenario involves regional resistance. As Teotihuacan's power waned, neighboring cities that had once been subordinate may have asserted independence. They may have sent warriors to Teotihuacan, not to conquer but to humiliate, to burn the symbols of a power that had dominated them for centuries. There is also evidence of more personal forms of resistance. Graffiti scratched into walls, crude drawings that seem to mock ritual scenes, deliberate damage to murals, faces of gods or priests scraped away by unknown hands. These small acts of defiance suggest individuals who rejected the city's values, who found ways to express dissent even in a society that demanded conformity. And then there are the people who simply left. Migration is a form of resistance, a vote with one's feet. As Teotihuacan's population declined in the 7th and 8th centuries, thousands of people chose to abandon the city. They went to other urban centers or returned to rural life, seeking opportunities or freedoms they could not find in Teotihuacan. Their departure was a rejection, a statement that the city no longer served their needs, and as more people left as the population dwindled, the city's ability to maintain itself declined, creating a downward spiral that eventually led to abandonment. Not all resistance was violent or dramatic. Much of it was subtle, the quiet assertion of autonomy in daily life. A potter who refused to use the standard Teotihuacan style. A family that buried their dead in a different orientation. a merchant who traded outside the official networks. These small acts accumulated, creating spaces of independence within the city's grid. The opposition to Teotihuacan reminds us that ancient cities were not monolithic, not uniform in thought and practice. They were contested spaces where different groups competed for resources, for influence, for the right to define what the community would become. Teotihuacan's attempt to impose order, to standardize housing and organize production and regulate ritual was ambitious, but it was also fragile. It required constant effort to maintain, constant negotiation with those who preferred other ways of living, and ultimately it failed. The resistors won, or perhaps more accurately, the system collapsed under its own weight, unable to accommodate dissent, unable to adapt when circumstances changed. The opposition to Teotihuacan was not necessarily virtuous. Resistance is not always progressive or liberating. Those who burned the temples may have been motivated by greed or revenge as much as by desire for justice. Those who maintained separate identities in foreign enclaves may have been as hierarchical and oppressive within their own communities as the Teotihuacan elite. But their resistance was human. It reflected the universal tension between individual autonomy and collective purpose, between tradition and change, between the desire for order and the need for freedom. Teotihuacan tried to create a perfect city, a place where thousands lived in harmony, where everyone contributed to a shared vision. But perfection is impossible when humans are involved. We resist, we question, we carve our own paths, even when the city has planned every street. The opposition to Teotihuacan, visible only in fragments and ruins, is as much a part of the city's story as the pyramids themselves. After Teotihuacan fell, after its population scattered and its temples crumbled, the city did not disappear from memory. It became something else, something more than stone and plaster. It became myth. The Aztecs, arriving in the Valley of Mexico in the 13th and 14th centuries, found the ruins and were transformed by them. They walked through the silent avenues, climbed the weathered pyramids, and experienced what can only be called an awakening, a sudden understanding that they were part of a much larger story. The Aztecs had been nomads, wanderers from the north, tribes without permanent cities or monumental architecture. They had been looked down upon by the settled peoples of central Mexico, dismissed as barbarians, as chichimecs, dog people. But when they saw Teotihuacan, everything changed. Here was proof that greatness was possible, that the gods favoured this land, that a people could rise from nothing to build wonders. The Aztecs claimed Teotihuacan as their heritage. They invented stories connecting themselves to the ancient city, claiming that their ancestors had participated in its glory. This was fiction. Teotihuacan had been abandoned 500 years before the Aztecs arrived. But it was a useful fiction, one that gave them legitimacy, that transformed them from outsiders to heirs of a sacred tradition. They made pilgrimages to Teotihuacan. Kings and priests climbed the pyramids, left offerings of jade and obsidian, performed rituals in the old plazas. They excavated tunnels beneath the pyramids, searching for burials or hidden chambers that might contain power or knowledge, and they began to build. The Aztec capital, Tenochtitlan, was conceived as a new Teotihuacan, a city that would equal or surpass the ancient glory. They oriented their main temple complex to echo Teotihuacan's layout. They adopted the talud tablero architectural style. They invoked the gods they believed had been worshipped at Teotihuacan, Tlaloc and Quetzalcoatl, making them central to Aztec religion. In a sense, Teotihuacan experienced a renaissance through the Aztecs. The city was physically ruined, but culturally it was reborn. Its ideas, its artistic styles, its religious symbolism, all were revived and transformed. This was not unique to the Aztecs. Throughout the post-classic period from 900 to 1500 AD, cities across Mesoamerica looked to Teotihuacan as a model. Tula, the Toltec capital, incorporated Teotihuacan imagery into its monuments. Cholula, a city that rivaled Tenochtitlan in size, built its Great Pyramid partly as an homage to Teotihuacan's pyramids. Teotihuacan became a touchstone, a standard against which later civilizations measured themselves. To claim connection to the ancient city was to claim sophistication, to demonstrate that one's culture had deep roots, that it participated in a tradition older and grander than any living memory. The Renaissance was not just political or religious, it was artistic. Craftsmen studied Teotihuacan murals, learning techniques for creating plaster and mixing pigments. They copied motifs, the goggle-eyed rain god, the feathered serpent, the geometric patterns that framed ritual scenes. These images appeared in codices, on pottery, on the walls of new temples. The Aztecs even tried to restore parts of Teotihuacan. They rebuilt staircases on the pyramids. They added new sculptures to old platforms. They plastered over damaged murals. Their work was often crude compared to the original, but it demonstrated reverence, a desire to honour what had come before. In this way, Teotihuacan shaped the cultural landscape of Mesoamerica long after its political power had vanished. It became a shared reference point, a source of inspiration and legitimacy for diverse peoples. The awakening was not limited to the pre-Columbian period. When modern Mexico was forming its national identity in the 19th and 20th centuries, after independence from Spain, Teotihuacan again played a crucial role. Mexican intellectuals and artists looked to the ancient city as proof that indigenous civilizations were equal to those of Europe, that Mexico's heritage was glorious, worthy of pride. They painted murals depicting Teotihuacan's splendor. They wrote poems and novels set in the ancient city. They made the pyramids into symbols of national identity. The excavation and restoration of Teotihuacan became a national project. The Mexican government funded large-scale archaeological work, not just for scientific knowledge, but to create a monument that Mexicans could point to with pride, that tourists from around the world would marvel at. This modern renaissance transformed Teotihuacan from a subject of academic study into a living part of Mexican culture. School children visited the pyramids on field trips. Families made pilgrimages on weekends. Artists drew inspiration from the murals. Musicians composed pieces evoking the ancient city's grandeur. Today, Teotihuacan is one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world. Millions of people climb the pyramids each year, stand atop the Pyramid of the Sun, gaze down the Avenue of the Dead, and feel connected to something ancient and profound. This is the cultural renaissance of Teotihuacan, not a single moment but a recurring pattern. A city that dies and is reborn, that collapses and is rediscovered, that inspires generation after generation to reach for greatness. The stones remain the same, but their meaning changes, adapts, grows. Teotihuacan was built by people who are gone, whose names we will never know, but it continues to live in the imagination, continues to awaken something in those who encounter it, an awakening to history, to the depth of human achievement, an awakening to possibility, to what can be built when people work together, an awakening to mystery, to the knowledge that some questions will never be answered, that the past will always hold secrets. The city where gods were born continues to give birth, not to deities, but to wonder, to pride, to the understanding that we are all part of a story much larger and older than ourselves. In 2003, archaeologists working at Teotihuacan made a discovery that would change our understanding of the city. Beneath the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, they found a tunnel, deliberately sealed almost 2,000 years ago, hidden and forgotten until ground-penetrating radar revealed its presence. The tunnel was not a natural cave. It had been excavated, enlarged, shaped by human hands. It stretched more than 100 meters beneath the pyramid, descending into darkness, ending in a series of chambers deep in the earth. For years, researchers prepared to explore it. They stabilized the ceiling, cleared ancient fill, and finally, in 2014, sent in remote-controlled robots equipped with cameras and laser scanners to see what no human eye had seen for millennia. What they found astonished them. The tunnel walls were covered in powdered pyrite, iron sulfide that would have glittered like stars in torchlight. The ceiling had been carved to resemble a night sky, and scattered throughout the chambers were thousands of objects, jade carvings, rubber balls, pottery vessels, shells from distant oceans, and pools of liquid mercury. Mercury, that strange metal that flows like water, shimmers like silver, was sacred to Mesoamerican peoples. It was rare, difficult to obtain, and may have symbolized water, or the underworld, or both. To find it here, pooled deliberately in the deepest chamber, suggested ritual of the highest importance. The tunnel may have been a symbolic underworld, a recreation of the mythical place from which the gods emerged, from which humanity was born. To enter it would have been to walk through the cosmos, to descend into the realm of the dead and the divine. Some archaeologists believe the tunnel was a royal tomb, that somewhere in those chambers lie the remains of Teotihuacan's rulers, the kings or queens whose existence is denied by the absence of royal imagery in the city's art. If this is true, if bodies are found, it would revolutionize our understanding of how Teotihuacan was governed. But the tunnel has not yet yielded human remains. It may never. It may have been sealed empty, a monument to belief rather than burial. Or the remains may have disintegrated completely, dissolved by groundwater and time. Regardless, the tunnel reveals a deeper truth about Teotihuacan. The city's builders invested enormous effort in creating spaces that were never meant to be seen, chambers that would be sealed immediately after completion, art that would disappear into darkness. This tells us something profound. Teotihuacan was not built for human eyes alone. It was built for the gods, or for eternity, or for some future time when the earth would be opened and the sacred would be revealed. The revelation goes beyond the tunnel. Every excavation at Teotihuacan uncovers evidence of deliberate burial, of things hidden with intention. Murals are plastered over, their beauty concealed beneath new construction. Offerings are placed beneath floors, sealed where no one would ever see them. Sculptures are broken and buried, ritually killed and interred like bodies. This practice of concealment suggests that visibility was not the point. The act of creation, the offering itself, mattered more than display. Teotihuacanos built for the unseen, for the divine gaze, for future generations who might one day uncover what had been hidden. Another revelation concerns the city's environmental impact. Recent studies of lake cores and soil samples reveal that Teotihuacan transformed its landscape dramatically. Forests were cleared, soil eroded, springs dried up as water was diverted to the city. By 600 AD, the environment around Teotihuacan was degraded, unable to support the large population. This environmental stress was likely a major factor in the city's decline, a self-inflicted wound that no amount of ritual or reorganization could heal. This revelation is sobering. It shows that even ancient peoples, often romanticized as living in harmony with nature, could damage their environment, could exploit resources unsustainably. Teotihuacan's grandeur came at a cost, paid by the land itself. But perhaps the deepest revelation is this. Teotihuacan was ordinary and extraordinary at the same time. Ordinary because it was built by people like us, people who struggled and failed, who made mistakes, who could not foresee the consequences of their actions. They were not wiser than we are, not more enlightened. They were human, with all the limitations that implies. Extraordinary, because despite those limitations, they built something magnificent. They organized 100,000 people into a functioning city. They created art that endures 2,000 years later. They developed astronomical knowledge and architectural techniques that impress us still. The revelation is that greatness does not require perfection. Teotihuacan's builders made errors, environmental, political, perhaps moral. Their city fell. Their names were forgotten. And yet what they built matters. It teaches us. It inspires us. It proves that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. The tunnel beneath the Temple of the Feathered Serpent is still being explored. More chambers may yet be found. More offerings may be uncovered. Perhaps one day human remains will be discovered, and we will finally know who ruled Teotihuacan, if anyone did. But even if the tunnel yields no more secrets, it has already given us the deepest truth. Teotihuacan was a city that believed in the unseen, that built for eternity, that invested as much care in what would be hidden as in what would be displayed. This is a different kind of ambition from our modern world, where visibility is everything, where achievements are measured by how many people see them, how many likes or views or followers they generate. Teotihuacan suggests another possibility, that the work itself is enough, that creation is its own reward, that some things are worth doing even if no one will ever know, even if the earth will swallow them, even if only the gods are watching. The revelation of Teotihuacan is not a single fact. It is a shift in perspective, an invitation to see differently, to value differently, to understand that greatness can be quiet, hidden, sealed in darkness beneath a pyramid, waiting for the day when the world will be ready to receive it. Teotihuacan stands today as it has stood for nearly 2,000 years, weathered by wind and rain, climbed by millions of feet, photographed from every angle, studied by generations of scholars. But what does it mean? What does this ancient city tell us about ourselves, about our own time, about the human condition? The first lesson is about anonymity. In our age of personal branding, of social media profiles and curated identities, Teotihuacan offers a radical alternative. Here was a civilization that achieved greatness without glorifying individuals, that built monuments without carving names into stone, that organized vast numbers of people without celebrating kings or emperors. This challenges our assumptions about what motivates human achievement. We assume people need recognition, need credit, need to be remembered. But Teotihuacan suggests otherwise. Perhaps the work itself was enough. Perhaps contributing to something larger than oneself provided meaning without requiring individual glory. This is not to romanticize Teotihuacan. The absence of royal imagery may reflect political control rather than egalitarianism. The standardized housing may have been experienced as oppression rather than equity. We cannot know, but the possibility remains, the possibility that achievement can be collective, that monuments can honor communities rather than individuals. The second lesson concerns environmental limits. Teotihuacan's builders transformed their landscape, cleared forests, diverted water, supported a population of more than 100,000 in a highland valley. For centuries it worked. The city thrived. But eventually the land could not sustain the demands placed upon it. The springs failed, the soil eroded, the city declined. This story resonates in our modern world, where we face our own environmental crises, our own questions about sustainability. Teotihuacan did not have the scientific knowledge we possess, did not understand ecology or climate change. But we do. And yet, like them, we continue to push against natural limits, hoping that innovation or ritual or sheer determination will allow us to escape consequences. Teotihuacan's fall is a warning. It shows that civilizations can collapse not through conquest or catastrophe, but through slow degradation of the systems that support them. It shows that grandeur and vulnerability can coexist, that a city can be magnificent and fragile at the same time. The third lesson is about diversity and unity. Teotihuacan was cosmopolitan, a place where people from across Mesoamerica came together. They did not abandon their identities. The foreign enclaves maintained distinct practices, but they also participated in a shared urban culture, worked in the same markets, walked the same streets, contributed to the same monumental projects. In our globalized world, where migration and multiculturalism create both opportunity and tension, Teotihuacan offers a model, imperfect but real, of how diverse peoples can coexist in a single urban space. It shows that unity does not require uniformity, that a city can be both cosmopolitan and coherent. The fourth lesson concerns memory and forgetting. Teotihuacan forgot itself. Its language died. Its name was lost. The people who built it scattered, carrying fragments of their culture to other cities, but leaving no written record, no clear lineage, no way for future generations to know who they had been. And yet, Teotihuacan endured, not through texts or inscriptions, but through stone and plaster, through art and architecture, through the sheer physical presence of the pyramids that refused to disappear. This suggests that there are different ways of being remembered. We privilege written history, documentation, explicit records, but Teotihuacan shows that material culture can also preserve memory, that buildings can be texts, that the arrangement of space can encode knowledge. In our digital age, where everything is documented, where every moment can be captured and stored, Teotihuacan's silence is striking. It reminds us that some things cannot be reduced to words, that mystery has value, that not everything needs to be explained. The fifth lesson is about time. Teotihuacan flourished for 6 centuries, longer than the United States has existed, longer than the Aztec or Spanish empires. From the perspective of its inhabitants, it may have seemed eternal, the only world they knew, unchanging and unchallengeable. But it fell, and now it is ruins. This perspective is humbling. It suggests that nothing we build will last forever, that all our institutions and monuments are temporary, that time will eventually reduce even our greatest achievements to fragments for future archaeologists to puzzle over. But this is not a counsel of despair. Teotihuacan mattered. It shaped Mesoamerican civilization for 1,000 years after its fall. It influenced art and religion and urban planning. It inspired the Aztecs and countless others. Its impact outlived its existence. This suggests that what we do now matters, even if it does not last forever, even if our names are eventually forgotten. We are part of a chain, links connecting past and future, building on what came before, creating foundations for what comes after. The sixth lesson is about aspiration. Teotihuacan reached high. Its builders attempted something audacious, creating a city that rivaled anything in the ancient world, organizing society in unprecedented ways, building pyramids that would endure for millennia. They succeeded, at least for a time. And even in failure, even in abandonment, their ambition inspires. It shows what humans can accomplish when they dare to dream beyond the limits of their individual lives. In our cynical age, when grand visions often seem naive or dangerous, Teotihuacan reminds us that aspiration has value, that attempting great things is worthwhile even if success is uncertain. The final lesson is about questions. Teotihuacan leaves more questions than answers. Who ruled it? What language did they speak? What did they call themselves? Why did they leave? These questions will likely never be fully answered, but perhaps that is the point. Perhaps Teotihuacan's gift to us is not answers, but wonder, not certainty but humility, not closure but an invitation to keep searching, keep questioning, keep trying to understand. We look at Teotihuacan and see ourselves reflected, our ambitions and our failures, our creativity and our limits. We see what is possible and what is lost. We see the human desire to build something that lasts and the inevitable reality that nothing lasts forever. The city where gods were born teaches us that we are not gods, but it also shows us that we can create things of profound beauty and meaning, that we can work together towards shared visions, that we can leave behind more than we found. And sometimes, in the quiet moments, standing atop a pyramid built by hands long turned to dust, we can feel connected to something larger than ourselves, something that transcends time and language and death. That connection is what Teotihuacan means for us. The sun sets behind the Pyramid of the Sun, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Shadows stretch across the Avenue of the Dead. Tourists descend the steep stairs, heading toward the exits before the site closes for the night. Soon, the ancient city will be alone again with the stars, just as it was for centuries before the archaeologists arrived, before the Aztecs made their pilgrimages, before anyone remembered that this place had once been the center of the world. But Teotihuacan is never truly alone. The stones remember, the earth remembers, and we remember, even if imperfectly, even if through myths and misunderstandings and the fragmentary evidence left behind. The legacy of Teotihuacan lives in many forms. It lives in the restored pyramids that rise against the Mexican sky, monuments that draw millions of visitors each year, people from every corner of the globe who come to climb the steps and gaze across the valley and wonder what it must have been like when the city was alive. It lives in museums, in pottery shards and obsidian blades carefully labelled and displayed, in murals removed from walls and preserved behind glass, in jade carvings and shell ornaments that once adorned priests and merchants and ordinary people now long forgotten. It lives in academic journals and conferences, in the ongoing debates about governance and trade and the reasons for collapse, in the excavations that continue each season, slowly peeling back layers of time, revealing new chambers and offerings and evidence that reshapes our understanding. It lives in the Mexican national consciousness, in textbooks that teach children about the grandeur of their pre-Hispanic heritage, in murals painted by Diego Rivera and other artists who drew inspiration from ancient civilizations, in the pride that Mexicans feel when they point to Teotihuacan and say, "Our ancestors built this." It lives in the descendants of the Teotihuacanos, scattered though they are, their lineage mixed and diluted but not erased. The people who left the city did not vanish. They became part of other communities, other civilizations. Their genes survive in modern Mexicans. Their knowledge and traditions, transformed and adapted, continue in practices and beliefs across Mesoamerica. It lives in the landscape itself. The pyramids have become part of the natural world, mountains that happen to be human-made, landmarks visible for miles, orientations for travelers, reference points in a valley that has changed dramatically since Teotihuacan fell, but that still bears the imprint of the ancient city. And it lives in memory, not just historical memory, but something deeper, cultural memory, the sense that this place is sacred, that it holds power, that walking its streets connects us to something essential about human nature. When the Aztecs visited Teotihuacan, they felt this connection. They believed they were walking through the birthplace of the gods. They were wrong about the details, but right about the essence. Something was born here, not deities, but a vision of what humanity could achieve, a demonstration of collective power, a monument to ambition and creativity. When modern visitors climb the pyramids, they feel it too, not because they believe in Aztec mythology, but because the scale and beauty of Teotihuacan touch something universal, the capacity for wonder, the recognition of greatness, the humility that comes from confronting something built to outlast its builders. The legacy is also cautionary. Teotihuacan reminds us that civilizations fall, that success does not guarantee survival, that environmental degradation and social conflict can bring down even the mightiest cities. This lesson is uncomfortable perhaps, but necessary. The stones that remain, weathered and silent, are fragments of a larger whole. So much is lost. The wooden roofs that once sheltered families, the gardens that grew in courtyards, the markets filled with voices haggling in languages we will never hear, the music and laughter and arguments and prayers, all gone, dissolved into time like morning mist. But the stones are enough. They are sufficient testimony that Teotihuacan existed, that it mattered, that the people who built it were real and complex and human. They struggled and celebrated, worked and rested, loved and grieved, just as we do. The legacy in stone is permanence without rigidity, endurance without perfection. The pyramids are not as they were built. They have been restored, sometimes incorrectly. They have been damaged by earthquakes and erosion and careless excavation, and yet they stand, they adapt, they continue. The legacy in memory is different. It is fluid, changing with each generation that encounters Teotihuacan. The Aztecs remembered it as a place of divine creation. Colonial scholars remembered it as evidence of lost tribes or European visitors. Modern archaeologists remember it as a complex urban society, with lessons for our own time. Each memory is partial. Each adds a layer of interpretation. And Teotihuacan absorbs them all, becomes richer with each retelling, even when the retellings contradict each other. Perhaps this is the deepest legacy. Teotihuacan teaches us that the past is not fixed, not a single story to be discovered and told. It is multiple stories, shifting perspectives, interpretations that change as we change. We will never know Teotihuacan as it knew itself. That knowledge died with the last person who called it home, but we can know it in our own way, through our own questions and concerns, finding in its ruins the reflections of our own hopes and fears. As night falls completely, as the last visitors leave and the guards lock the gates, Teotihuacan returns to silence. The pyramids become silhouettes against the darkening sky. Stars appear, the same stars that shone on the city 2,000 years ago, the same patterns that Teotihuacan's builders encoded in their architecture. Somewhere beneath the pyramids, in sealed chambers and forgotten tunnels, there are still secrets waiting, objects buried deliberately, offerings meant for gods or eternity or future generations who might one day return. We are those future generations. We have returned. We have opened some of the chambers, uncovered some of the offerings, but much remains hidden, protected by earth and time and the sheer vastness of what was built. The legacy of Teotihuacan is incomplete. It will always be incomplete, and that is as it should be. Mystery is part of the gift. Wonder requires the unknown. The city where gods were born gives us permission to dream, to build, to reach beyond ourselves. It also teaches us humility, reminds us that we too will become ruins, that our certainties will become future generations' mysteries. But in the moment, under the stars, surrounded by stones laid by hands long turned to dust, we can feel the connection. We can sense the thread that links us to those ancient builders, the shared humanity that transcends time. Teotihuacan endures, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to matter, enough to teach, enough to inspire wonder in those who walk its avenue and climb its pyramids and ask the eternal questions. Who were they? What did they believe? Why did they build? The stones cannot answer in words, but in their silence, in their presence, in their refusal to disappear, They offer something more valuable than answers. They offer themselves, a legacy in stone and memory, a gift from the past to the future, a reminder that we are all part of a story much larger and longer than any single life. Welcome to Teotihuacan, the city where gods were born, the city where humans built wonders, the city that never truly dies.